Picture a single night in October of 1973. Bangkok is on fire. Not literally everywhere, but close enough. Hundreds of thousands of students and workers have flooded Ratchadamnoan Avenue, marching toward the Democracy Monument, to demand the resignation of a military government that has ruled Thailand for the better part of a decade. Soldiers open fire, tanks roll past temple gates. By the time the smoke clears, dozens of protesters are dead in the street. And then something happens that, in almost any other country in the region, at almost any other point in the 20th century, would not have happened. The king opens the gates of Chitralada Palace to the fleeing students, shelters them from the army that answers to his own government, and within days the military strongmen who ran the country are gone, flown out on the same air force that had just been firing on civilians. The monarchy did not fall that week. It got stronger. And that single fact, repeated in different forms across nearly a century, is the thread running through the story of why one throne in Southeast Asia is still standing, while every single one of its neighbors collapsed, was abolished, or was reduced to a name on a plaque in a museum nobody visits anymore. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how unusual Thailand's survival really is, you have to look at the wreckage around it first. Start with Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty had ruled since 1802, and by 1945 its last emperor, Bao Dai, was abdicating to a revolutionary government in Hanoi, handing over the royal seal and sword in a ceremony he later described as the saddest of his life. He spent the rest of his years drifting between Hong Kong and the French Riviera, briefly restored as a figurehead by the French in a doomed attempt to hold on to Indochina, then discarded again in 1955 when a referendum, widely understood to have been rigged, ended the monarchy for good. He died in a military hospital outside Paris in 1997, a private citizen with no throne, no country, and by the end, almost no money. Move west to Laos. The kingdom there had one of the gentlest, most reluctant final chapters of any monarchy on earth. King Sisavangvatana did not resist the communist Pathet Lao when they took power in 1975. He abdicated peacefully, apparently believing cooperation would protect his family. Instead, he, his queen, and his crown prince were sent to a re-education camp in the remote northeast of the country, a place called Sop Hao, and simply vanished from the historical record. For years, the Lao government would not confirm whether they were alive or dead. It eventually emerged that the king had died in captivity around 1978, most likely of starvation or disease, though even that detail remains contested, because no independent observer was ever allowed to see the camp. There is no grave anyone can visit. Then there is Cambodia, where the story is stranger still. King Norodom Sihanouk was deposed in a coup in 1970 while he was traveling abroad, and when the Khmer Rouge seized power 5 years later, the monarchy was formally abolished altogether. Sihanouk himself was brought back to Phnom Penh and held under house arrest inside his own palace, while the regime he had once cautiously allied with murdered an estimated 1.5 million of his countrymen, including members of his own extended family. The monarchy was restored on paper in 1993 as part of a United Nations peace settlement, but it returned as a fragile, constitutionally boxed-in institution with a fraction of its former authority, propped up by a political settlement rather than by any organic continuity with the past. And further west, in what is now Myanmar, the Konbaung dynasty simply stopped existing. The British exiled the last king, Thibaw, to India in 1885 after the Third Anglo-Burmese War, and the monarchy was never restored under any government since, colonial, independent, or military. His palace at Mandalay was looted, his throne shipped off to a museum in Calcutta. 4 monarchies, 4 completely different endings. Execution by starvation, abolition by revolution, house arrest under a genocidal regime, and colonial erasure. Not one of them kept its crown. And sitting in the middle of all of it, sharing borders, sharing colonial pressure, sharing the same 20th century storms of revolution and war, Thailand's monarchy is still there, still occupying palaces, still appearing on the currency, still, for many of its citizens, functioning as something close to a religious institution rather than merely a political one. The reason usually offered first, and it is a real one, is that Siam was never colonized. Wedged between British Burma and French Indochina, the kingdom survived the 19th century's carve-up of Southeast Asia by becoming useful to both empires as a buffer rather than a target. King Mongkut, who took the throne in 1851, had spent nearly 3 decades as a Buddhist monk before becoming king, and he used that time studying Latin, English, and Western science with missionaries, concluding that Siam's only path to survival was to look modern enough that no European power felt the need to civilize it by force. His son, King Chulalongkorn, who reigned from 1868 to 1910, pushed the project further than anyone expected. He abolished slavery gradually enough not to collapse the economy, built railways, reorganized the bureaucracy along European lines, and personally toured the courts of Europe, dining with kings and kaisers as something closer to an equal than a curiosity. Every one of these reforms served a single purpose: keep Siam sovereign and keep the crown at the center of that sovereignty. It worked. But surviving colonization is only half the story, because being uncolonized did not save the neighboring monarchies from their own people. What actually happened inside Siam in the 20th century is where the real answer lives, and it starts with a revolution that, on paper, should have ended the Chakri dynasty the same way revolutions ended almost everything else. On the 24th of June 1932, a group calling itself the People's Party, a coalition of Western-educated military officers and civil servants, staged a bloodless coup while King Prajadipok was away at his seaside palace. They seized government buildings, arrested key ministers, and presented the king with an ultimatum. Thailand would become a constitutional monarchy, or the People's Party would consider more drastic options. Prajadipok, who had already been quietly studying constitutional reform himself, agreed. And this is the detail that separates Thailand's 20th century from every other fallen throne in the region. The revolutionaries did not abolish the monarchy. They kept it, stripped of absolute power but preserved as the nation's ceremonial and spiritual anchor, because even the men overthrowing the king recognized that the crown carried a legitimacy no republic could manufacture overnight. It was a decision made out of pragmatism as much as reverence, and it set a pattern that would repeat for the rest of the century. Real power would shift, sometimes violently, between generals, parties, and street movements, while the throne itself stayed fixed as the one institution nobody in power actually wanted to destroy. Prajadipok's own relationship with the new order soured quickly. In 1935, after a dispute over his royal pardon powers, he abdicated by telegram from a hotel room in England, spending his final years in quiet exile and dying there in 1941, the only Thai king of the modern era to leave the throne without dying in it or on it. His successor was a 10-year-old boy studying in Switzerland, Ananda Mahidol, who barely set foot in the country he nominally ruled until his early 20s. And then, on the 9th of June 1946, the young king was found dead in his bedroom at the Grand Palace from a single gunshot wound. The exact circumstances have never been fully settled in public record. 3 palace attendants were tried and eventually executed years later for the killing, though questions about the verdict persisted for decades afterward. What matters for this story is what came next. The throne passed, almost by accident, to Ananda's younger brother, an 18-year-old born in Massachusetts and raised largely outside Thailand, a young man named Bhumibol Adulyadej, who would go on to reign for 70 years and, more than anyone else, personally rebuild the monarchy into the institution that outlasted every one of its neighbors. For the first decade of his reign, Bhumibol was almost a spectator in his own kingdom, a young, quiet king overshadowed by a rotating cast of military strongmen who ran the country through coup after coup. That changed under Field Marshal Sarit Thanarat, who seized power in 1957 and made a calculated decision that would define Thai politics for the rest of the century. Rather than sideline the monarchy the way military rulers in so many other countries sidelined or eliminated theirs, Sarit revived royal ceremony deliberately, restoring elaborate court rituals that had been quietly allowed to lapse since 1932, sending the king on provincial tours, putting his image back on official media, and rebuilding the crown as a source of legitimacy that a military government, which had none of its own, badly needed to borrow. Political scientists studying Thailand later gave this arrangement a name, network monarchy, describing a system in which the palace and the army reinforced each other's authority without either one fully controlling the other. It was a partnership built on mutual usefulness, and Bhumibol, whatever his private feelings about any individual general, understood exactly how to use his side of it. He spent the following decades touring rural provinces that had rarely, if ever, seen a member of the royal family, funding irrigation schemes, crop substitution programs to move farmers away from opium poppies, water management projects in areas the central government had largely ignored. By the time of his death, more than 4,000 royally initiated development projects existed across the country. He became known to ordinary Thais not primarily as a distant absolute ruler, but as the developer king, a figure who appeared to care about muddy irrigation canals in provinces most of Bangkok's elite had never visited. That image did enormous work. It gave the monarchy a source of popular legitimacy that had nothing to do with the 18th century divine right his ancestors had once claimed, and everything to do with a 20th century performance of service. That legitimacy was tested again and again, and each time the throne emerged more central rather than less. 3 years after the palace gates opened to fleeing students in 1973, the mood turned dark again. On the 6th of October 1976, right-wing paramilitary groups and police stormed Thammasat University, where students had gathered to protest the return of an exiled former dictator. What followed was a massacre. Students beaten, shot, and in some documented cases lynched on the university grounds while a crowd looked on, followed swiftly by a military coup that installed one of the most repressive governments in modern Thai history. The palace's role in that day remains one of the most debated chapters of Bhumibol's reign, and unlike 1973, this was not a moment where the crown intervened to shelter the protesters. But the monarchy survived the controversy largely intact, in part because the institution had, by then, positioned itself as something separate from any single government's actions, a permanent fixture above the churn of coups rather than a participant in any one of them. That positioning paid off spectacularly in May of 1992. A military government under General Suchinda Kraprayun had crushed pro-democracy protests with gunfire, and the country stood on the edge of a genuine civil crisis. Bhumibol summoned Suchinda and the protest leader Chamlong Srimuang to a televised royal audience, and the image broadcast that night, both men kneeling on the floor before the seated king, remains one of the most replayed pieces of footage in modern Thai history. Within days, Suchinda resigned. It was widely read, at home and abroad, as proof that the monarchy stood above politics, as the nation's final arbiter, the one institution capable of ending a crisis that elected governments and the army itself could not resolve on their own. That authority was reinforced by two structures that most of Thailand's fallen neighboring monarchies never had. The first was legal. Thailand's lèse-majesté law, Article 112 of the Criminal Code, makes it a crime to defame, insult, or threaten the king, the queen, the heir, or the regent, carrying a potential sentence of 3 to 15 years for each offense. Enforcement has varied sharply across different governments and different periods, sometimes rarely applied, sometimes used aggressively against critics and even against academic historians, but its mere existence on the books has shaped Thai public discourse around the monarchy for generations, making the institution largely immune from the kind of open political criticism that eroded royal legitimacy elsewhere in the region long before revolution or invasion ever arrived. The second structure was financial. The Crown Property Bureau, established in its modern form in the 1930s, grew over the following decades into one of the largest asset holders in the country, with major stakes in the Siam Commercial Bank and the Siam Cement Group, along with vast tracts of prime real estate across central Bangkok. Estimates of the Bureau's total value have run into the tens of billions of dollars, making the Thai crown, by some measures, the wealthiest monarchy on earth, a level of independent economic power that gave the institution a resilience no purely ceremonial or state-funded monarchy could match. None of Vietnam's, Laos's, Cambodia's, or Burma's royal houses ever controlled anything remotely comparable, which meant that when their political fortunes turned, they had no independent base of wealth or legal protection to fall back on. Thailand's monarchy had both, layered on top of 7 decades of a king who had spent his reign building a reservoir of genuine popular affection in provinces the government itself had neglected. By the time Bhumibol's health began visibly failing in the early 2010s, the institution he had spent a lifetime rebuilding looked, by any regional comparison, close to unshakable. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Bhumibol died on the 13th of October 2016 at Siriraj Hospital in Bangkok, after months of declining health that had already plunged the country into a kind of anticipatory mourning. The scale of the grief that followed is difficult to convey to anyone who did not witness it. Millions of Thais wore black for the following year. Long queues formed daily outside the Grand Palace for people waiting hours simply to sign a condolence book or bow before a portrait. The government declared a full year of official mourning, and the cremation itself, held in October of 2017 inside a purpose-built funeral complex on Bangkok's Sanam Luang Field, drew hundreds of thousands of mourners to the streets to watch the procession pass. Whatever the underlying political mechanics of the monarchy's power, the outpouring of that year reflected something that could not be manufactured by any law or any bureau of assets alone: a genuine, deeply felt public attachment to the man who had occupied the throne for 7 decades, longer than almost any other monarch in recorded history. His only son, Crown Prince Maha Vajiralongkorn, ascended as Rama X, though he waited more than a year before formally accepting the throne and delayed his coronation until May of 2019, an unusually long gap that fueled endless quiet speculation in a country where openly speculating about the monarchy carries real legal risk. Where his father had spent decades building an image around rural development tours and irrigation projects, Vajiralongkorn took the institution in a markedly different direction almost immediately. In 2017, the legal structure of the Crown Property Bureau was quietly amended, shifting assets that had technically been held for the institution of the monarchy into holdings placed directly under the king's personal name, giving him individual legal control over a fortune historians estimate in the tens of billions of dollars, a level of direct personal command over crown wealth that even his father had never held outright. He also took direct personal command of several army units previously under standard military structure, folding them into a royal security command answerable to the palace rather than the defense ministry. His personal life, including extended stretches of time spent in Germany rather than in Thailand and a series of public marriages and separations, became the subject of extensive foreign press coverage, even as domestic Thai media remained tightly constrained by lèse-majesté law from reporting most of it directly. Enforcement of that same law intensified sharply during his reign, with prosecutions and sentences reaching levels unseen even during some of the country's more repressive military periods, a pattern that themselves became, for the first time in living memory, a subject of open street protest. Starting in the middle of 2020, a new generation of Thai student demonstrators did something that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. Alongside long-standing demands for the resignation of the military-aligned government and a rewritten constitution, protest leaders openly called for reform of the monarchy itself, publicly reading out a list of 10 demands that included curbing the king's personal control over crown assets and the army units under his command, and reducing the reach of the lèse-majesté law. It was the most direct public challenge to the institution's authority since 1932, and the government's response was swift and severe, with hundreds of prosecutions under Article 112 following in the years after. The monarchy that emerged from that period looked in some ways more exposed than at any point since Bhumibol's early quiet years on the throne, its legitimacy no longer simply assumed by an entire population the way it had seemed to be during the depths of the 2016 mourning. And yet, measured against the fate of every other throne in the region, the institution was still there, still holding formal constitutional status, still commanding an army built partly around loyalty to the crown, still sitting on one of the largest concentrated fortunes of any royal house on the planet, still, whatever the private doubts of a new generation, functioning as the nation's constitutional head of state rather than as an exile's memory or a name on a museum placard. It helps to understand just how strange Thailand's coup habit looks from the outside, because on paper a country living through repeated military takeovers should be the last place on earth for any hereditary institution to feel secure. Since the 1932 revolution, Thailand has experienced somewhere around 13 successful coups and roughly as many failed attempts, a rate unmatched by almost any other country in the modern world. In most nations, that kind of chronic instability eats away at every institution it touches, including the ones that claim to sit above politics. In Thailand, it did something close to the opposite, because the generals repeatedly needed a source of legitimacy they could not manufacture themselves. They kept turning to the same institution to provide it, staging their coups in the crown's name, seeking royal endorsement within days of seizing power, and framing their interventions as acts of loyal protection rather than rebellion. The king, for his part, rarely intervened directly, but the willingness to grant swift audiences and formal blessing to whichever government held the guns at any given moment meant the palace was almost never seen as the loser in any individual power struggle. Every coup came and went. The institution issuing its quiet stamp of approval stayed exactly where it was. Compare that to Laos or Cambodia, where a monarchy that picked the wrong side of a single revolutionary movement had no second chance, no rotating cast of rival generals to hedge between. Thailand's throne effectively ensured itself against any one political faction's collapse by refusing to fully attach itself to any single one of them, which meant that no matter which government fell, fled, or was executed, the monarchy simply outlasted it and welcomed whoever came next. It is worth stepping back even further than Southeast Asia, because the pattern holds against monarchies that fell for entirely different reasons on the other side of the world. China's last emperor, Puyi, sat on a throne that had endured in some form for 2,000 years, and when the imperial system finally collapsed in 1912, no revolutionary government bothered preserving him as a unifying symbol the way Thailand's officers preserved their king 20 years later. He was allowed to keep his title inside a shrinking palace for a while, then stripped of it entirely, then used as a puppet by a foreign occupying army, then imprisoned, then remade by a communist re-education program into an ordinary citizen who spent his final years pulling weeds in a public garden. Germany's last Kaiser, Wilhelm II, lost his throne within 48 hours of a naval mutiny in 1918, and spent the rest of his life chopping wood in Dutch exile, watching a war he had helped start curdle into something far worse, under a dictator who had no use for him at all. Both men ruled empires vastly larger and older than Siam ever was. Both institutions had centuries of accumulated prestige behind them, and in both cases, when the moment of crisis arrived, there was no political faction inside the country with any incentive to keep the crown around, because the monarchy itself was seen as the obstacle to modernization rather than a tool for achieving it. Thailand's 1932 revolutionaries made the opposite calculation. They needed a unifying figurehead precisely because their own claim to govern was fragile and contested, and an 800-year-old royal line, even stripped of absolute power, was the one thing in the country that could not be dismissed as just another faction. That single strategic choice, made by a small group of officers one morning in Bangkok, is arguably the hinge on which this entire story turns. Set that against the neighbors one more time, because the contrast is the whole point of this story. Vietnam's last emperor died a private citizen in a Paris hospital with no throne to return to and no dynasty left to inherit one. Laos's last king starved or sickened to death in a jungle re-education camp whose exact location outsiders were never permitted to confirm, his grave, if one exists, unknown even to his own descendants. Cambodia's monarchy survived only by being formally abolished, restored decades later as a fragile constitutional compromise brokered by foreign diplomats, rather than sustained by any unbroken royal authority of its own. Burma's royal line was shipped off in a British steamer in 1885 and simply never came back. Its palace looted, its throne room turned into a museum exhibit under a government that, whether colonial, socialist, or military, never once considered restoring the crown. 4 different endings. Execution by starvation, revolutionary abolition, colonial exile, or restoration so hollowed out it barely resembles what came before. There is a specific image worth holding on to from those 2020 protests, because it sits almost perfectly against the image this story opened with. Outside the Democracy Monument, the same stretch of pavement where students had once fled toward an open palace gate in 1973, a new generation of demonstrators raised 3 fingers into the air, a salute borrowed from a dystopian film franchise and repurposed as a symbol of defiance against the government and, for the first time openly, against the institution of the crown itself. Some of those protesters were later arrested under the same lèse-majesté law that had shielded the monarchy from open criticism for the better part of a century. Others walked free after negotiated settlements, or after charges quietly lapsed, or after courts issued rulings that satisfied almost nobody. The government that Vajiralongkorn's reign has been aligned with, dominated for years by figures connected to the 2014 military coup that brought the current constitutional order into being, has treated any organized push for royal reform as an existential threat, rather than a policy debate, which tells you something the palace itself has mostly declined to say in public. The institution that once opened its gates to fleeing students is now, in the eyes of a meaningful share of a younger generation, the thing they are marching against rather than toward. That is a genuine reversal, and it is one no purely legal or financial explanation fully accounts for. Wealth and statute can insulate an institution from certain kinds of pressure. They cannot manufacture affection, and affection, the kind Bhumibol spent 7 decades cultivating one muddy irrigation canal at a time, is precisely the resource a monarchy cannot simply inherit from its predecessor. Whether Vajiralongkorn's reign ends up rebuilding that reservoir, spending it down further, or handing an eventual heir an institution transformed almost beyond recognition from the one his father built, is a question this story cannot answer, because it has not finished being written. What can be said with confidence is only this. Every one of the mechanisms that kept the Chakri dynasty standing while its neighbors fell, the deliberate choice by 1932's revolutionaries to preserve rather than abolish, the deep alliance struck with a coup-prone military that needed royal legitimacy more than the crown needed any single government, the enormous independent fortune housed in the Crown Property Bureau, the legal shield of Article 112, and the decades of grassroots goodwill Bhumibol built by showing up in places kings were not supposed to bother visiting, all of those mechanisms are still technically intact. Whether they remain sufficient in the face of a generation no longer willing to treat the institution as beyond question is the open argument playing out in Thailand right now, largely unresolved, and in most other fallen monarchies of the region, there was no equivalent argument to have, because by the time anyone might have raised it, there was no throne left standing to argue about. Thailand's crown, by contrast, weathered a revolution that stripped it of absolute power but chose, deliberately, to preserve it as a symbol. It weathered a king's mysterious death in his own bedroom. It weathered a dozen or more military coups, several of them carried out explicitly in the crown's name. It weathered massacres and mass protests and a global pandemic and a currently unresolved argument between its own citizens over how much power it should even hold going forward. None of that has been enough, so far, to end it. The throne that Chulalongkorn modernized to keep foreign gunboats away, that a group of revolutionary officers chose to preserve rather than abolish in 1932, that Sarat Thanarat rebuilt into a source of political legitimacy his own government could never generate on its own, that Bhumibol spent 70 years turning into something closer to a national faith than a political office, is still sitting, however uneasily, at the center of Thai public life. Every neighboring dynasty gambled on some version of resistance, exile, or accommodation with whatever revolutionary or colonial force came for it, and every one of those gambles ended with the crown gone. Thailand's monarchy made a different set of choices at nearly every fork in that same road, and whatever comes next for the institution, that difference is the reason it is still here to have an uncertain future in the first place, while its neighbors only have a past. Puyi ended his life pulling weeds in a public garden. Wilhelm II ended his chopping firewood in a borrowed Dutch house. Bao Dai died in a Paris hospital with nothing left to abdicate. Thailand's king, whatever his troubles, still wears a crown that history, again and again, declined to take away from him. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.